At the end of a small, quiet street in the suburbs of Oregon, there stood an old wooden house nestled beneath the canopy of aged maple trees. Moss covered the eaves. The windows were misted with condensation. The wooden steps, cracked and worn, looked as if no one had set foot on them for a long time. That house had once been warm, once echoed with laughter, once smelled of cinnamon waffles every morning. But now, everything seemed like faint echoes of the past. That house belonged to an old man named Henry, over 70, silver-haired, slender, but still carrying the neat appearance of someone born in a different era. Henry lived alone and had done so for nearly a year since his beloved wife, Elaine, passed away suddenly from a heart attack. From that day on, time in the house ticked by like a clock with no hands. Each morning he would make a cup of black tea, the kind she used to like. At noon, he'd eat a slice of cold bread, just to avoid the feeling of an empty stomach. In the afternoon, he'd sit by the window, rereading old letters, her slanted handwriting still etched in his memory. At night, he would silently turn off the lights early so he wouldn't have to endure another long, silent evening. He didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't speak of it. He simply stayed silent and got used to having no one to talk to, no one to ask, "Did you have a tiring day today?" There are kinds of loneliness, too deep to be named. Henry thought he might live out the rest of his life that way, slowly, quietly, and unnoticed, until one early winter afternoon. That day, the air had just turned chilly. Henry was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a teacup, his eyes absent-mindedly gazing out the window as they did every day. And then, he saw a small figure appear on the misted windowsill. It was a cat, small, skinny, dirty, but with bright amber eyes staring at him for a long time silently. It didn't meow, didn't scratch the door, it just stayed there. And just like that, something inside his heart, something he thought had gone cold after Elaine's death, stirred faintly. He cracked the door open. It stepped in, not afraid, not frantic, not asking permission. It walked in as if it had always belonged there. From that moment, a gentle journey began. A stray cat, a lonely aging heart, unrelated perhaps, but somehow they saved each other. This is not a story filled with sparkly miracles. There is no suspense, no dramatic climax, just the story of an old man who thought his life had ended and a small creature that happened to walk in, bringing just enough warmth to make the house feel alive again, and his heart began to open. Are you ready to join me in listening to that journey? Maybe somewhere in the story of Henry and the little stray cat, you'll find a bit of peace for your own heart too. There are homes whose windows face east and yet never catch the morning sunlight. Henry's house was one of those. Tucked in the middle of an old suburban neighborhood in Oregon, the small house carried the stillness of something that had long given up on being visited. And truth be told, it had been a long time since anyone came by. Henry lived alone, or more accurately, existed alone since the day his wife Elaine died of heart failure exactly 1 year ago. Elaine passed away in November. That autumn wasn't blazing red like the years before. It was gray, cold, as if the sky itself knew that one heart was about to stop beating. The funeral was quiet. A few neighbors came to say goodbye, offered a few words of comfort, but then everyone returned to their daily lives, everyone except Henry. For him, time stood still. Every day began the same for Henry. 6 a.m. The clock rang 3 times. He sat up, pulled on his wool robe and slid into his worn slippers, went down the stairs, turned on the kettle and made a cup of black tea. Not because he liked tea, but because it was Elaine's routine. He still made tea for 2, poured it into 2 cups and set them on the table by the window, where she used to sit and read. But the chair opposite him was always empty now. Henry had never been a talkative man. He was reserved, introspective. Elaine was the one who kept the house filled with light, with laughter. She loved flowers, loved sunshine, loved even the stray cats that climbed over the fence into their garden. She gave each one a name. One was Daisy, another Bishop, and there was one so lazy she named it Sleepy. Henry was different. He didn't hate cats but never paid much attention to them. He thought they were odd, independent creatures, distant, just like him. Since Elaine passed, the house had become oppressively quiet. No more afternoon classical music on the radio. No more sounds of her baking cinnamon waffles in the kitchen. No one to scold him for forgetting to water the lavender plants. Only the ticking of the clock and the occasional sigh. Sometimes even he didn't realize it came from himself. At noon, Henry ate alone, a slice of bread, some reheated soup. He had been a devoted husband, but never much of a cook. Elaine used to tease, "If you ever cooked, I'd probably feel full after 2 bites, out of fear." Now, no one teased him anymore. The dining table had 4 chairs. Now, only one bowl sat neatly in place. Elaine's napkin was still folded neatly in the drawer. He had never put it away. Each afternoon, Henry sat in his old armchair rereading the letters his wife had written when they were young. He kept every scrap of paper, every little poem she had scribbled on sticky notes and left on the fridge. Some nights he dreamed of her, still with her soft silver hair, her cream-colored sweater, and that gentle smile. Then he would wake up, seeing only the white ceiling and the dim light of the bedside lamp. He didn't cry. It was as if his tears had retreated, making way for a deeper sorrow, sorrow beyond words. His neighbor, Mrs. Doris, would occasionally drop by with some baked goods, ask a few questions, but Henry only nodded, offering a faint smile. He didn't know what to say, not because he didn't want to talk, but because saying it wouldn't make the emptiness go away. He was old enough to understand that some losses could never be filled with words. In the evenings, he would make another cup of tea, sit alone under the soft glow of a table lamp, sometimes reading old letters, sometimes just sitting still. Once he wrote a few lines on a piece of paper. "Elaine, do you still think of me? The house is so quiet. Sometimes I imagine you're just in the next room, but when I walk over, there's no one there." He placed the letter into a drawer where he kept all the things that no one else needed to read. On rainy days, Henry didn't go outside. He sat by the window watching the rain slide slowly down the glass like the pace of his own life. The garden out back, once filled with lavender and clover, now held only dry soil and a few bare branches. Henry no longer had the strength to replant, nor the reason to. One day, he turned on the radio. An old piece played, Claire de Lune, the one Elaine used to listen to whenever she felt sad. He closed his eyes, and for the briefest moment, he forgot he was alone. But when the music ended, silence returned like an undertow, and he remembered. He was still sitting by himself. Henry had grown used to that. He didn't expect anyone to knock, didn't hope for a phone call. He didn't resent life, nor did he blame fate. He simply thought, maybe this was how a person's life came to an end, slowly, quietly, like the final leaf falling unnoticed. Until one afternoon when Henry was standing at the sink, washing his teacup, a faint scratching sound came from the window. That afternoon, a chilly breeze swept through the street like autumn whispering that winter was drawing near. Henry stood at the sink, carefully wiping the porcelain cup with the golden rim, the only one left unbroken from the tea set he and Elaine had bought on their first trip to Boston. Outside the window, a few maple leaves drifted down, shimmering in the pale evening light. The house was as quiet as ever, with only the sound of dripping water and the soft rustle of his wool sweater as he moved. Then a sound, software, but enough to startle his heart, a faint scratch, like claws against glass. Henry looked up. There on the windowsill was a small shape. Not clear at first, just a round form, ash gray, blending into the dusky sky. He blinked, thinking he was mistaken. But then the shape moved, a slow shake of the head, a subtle twitch of whiskers, and 2 eyes, round, bright, like tiny flames glowing at twilight, stared back at him. A cat. It didn't meow, didn't paw at the door, didn't try to draw attention. It just sat there, wet, dirty, and slightly trembling, but with a strange calmness about it. Its eyes weren't pleading, nor were they wild. They just looked, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Henry stood frozen, still holding the tea towel. His heart skipped, not out of fear, but from a vague, familiar feeling passing through his mind. Elaine once said, "Cats don't come to those they don't choose. If a cat seeks you out, don't ignore it." Back then he only laughed, but now Henry couldn't laugh at all. He stepped toward the window. The cat didn't look away. 1 second, 2, then 3. No sound except the faint rustling of wind through the leaves. Henry opened the door a crack. The outside air drifted in, the scent of damp earth, the chill of autumn dusk, and a silence that belonged to wandering spirits. The cat didn't leap in. It waited, as if expecting him to say something first. After a moment, Henry bent down and softly whispered, "Come in if you need a place to rest." And surprisingly, it stepped in. Not rushed, not hesitant, not grateful. It walked slowly, deliberately, as if entering a place it had always known. Henry stepped back, so as not to block its path. His eyes filled with uncertainty, his heart beating fast, a sensation he couldn't recall the last time he had felt. The cat brushed past his legs, tail slightly raised, then turned into the corner of the room, where Elaine's old armchair still sat. It leapt onto the chair, curled up, and slept. Henry stood there, frozen. Something was happening, very small, very quiet, but unmistakable. He looked down at the floor. There were a few drops of water, a bit of dirt from its paws. Before, he might have wiped them up immediately. But today, he just stood there, then let out a breath, a sigh that wasn't heavy but light, as if someone had gently nudged open the door that had remained shut inside him for a whole year. He returned to the kitchen, placed a bowl of water beside the heater, then stood watching the flickering fire, its light casting a soft glow on the cat's ragged gray fur. It breathed steadily, slept peacefully, unafraid, not needing to ask for permission. Henry sat down in the chair across from it, the one he hadn't touched since Elaine's passing because it had always been hers. He folded his hands and watched in silence. The cat's eyes remained shut. Its fur rose and fell with each breath. Outside the window, the twilight had deepened into indigo, and Henry felt not entirely alone anymore. He didn't call it, didn't name it, didn't touch it, just sat and watched. And in that moment, something stirred gently within his chest, something that felt a little like hope. Before going to bed, he placed a soft cloth under the foot of the chair. When turning off the lights, he hesitated by the stairs, then softly spoke, unsure if he was talking to someone else or just to hear his own voice. "Sleep well. If you're still here tomorrow, we'll talk." That night, Henry tossed and turned, not because he was sad, but because for the first time he felt like he had a reason to look forward to morning. And when the first light of dawn shone through the fogged glass window, Henry woke as usual at 6 a.m. to the sound of the old alarm clock, but this time he didn't get up right away. He heard something faint, the sound of claws gently scratching the wool carpet downstairs. Henry closed his eyes a little longer, then smiled softly. "You're still here." The cat, still unnamed, inhabited the house in an oddly quiet way. It didn't demand, didn't make a mess, and didn't do anything to draw attention. It just was there. And that to Henry already meant so much. That afternoon, while making tea, he stood looking out at the backyard garden, the place where Elaine used to grow clover, lavender, and snapdragons, each with its own name, as if they were dear friends in her gentle life. Now the garden was mostly bare soil, but in a small corner, nestled among the fading brown, Henry spotted a single green clover, unexpected, soft and resilient, just like the eyes of that cat. That evening, As the cat dozed beside the fireplace, Henry set his tea down, looked at it for a long time, and gently said, "Clover, I'll call you Clover." The cat twitched its tail, a light flick as if in agreement. Henry smiled, not because Clover understood its name, but because, for the first time in many months, he felt something both new and familiar. Clover began forming routines of its own. In the mornings, it sat by the window, watching the sparrows flit between the fences. At noon, it curled up on Elaine's old woolen shawl. In the evenings, it lay at Henry's feet while he read, its head resting on his slipper, as if it had always belonged there. Henry didn't try to bond. He didn't coax, didn't call its name repeatedly. He simply let Clover exist in its own way, and that somehow brought them even closer. One day, while dusting the dining table, he noticed a faint paw print in the thin layer of dust. Henry didn't wipe it away. Instead, he placed his hand beside it, leaving a handprint next to the paw. That evening, he opened a drawer and took out an old leather-bound notebook. It was the journal he had once written for Elaine. One line each day, sometimes a short story, sometimes quiet thoughts never sent. After Elaine passed, the journal went silent. Not a single word added. But tonight, Henry wrote again. Day 1 dash. There's a cat sleeping in your chair. It didn't ask for permission, but it didn't need to, because when it curled up, I felt like you were returning. In the firelight, in the corner of the room, in the soft rhythm of breath, you used to say, "Some things don't need to be said. Just being here is enough." I think Clover's doing that. From that day on, Henry wrote a few lines every evening. Not long, not heavy. Just small observations about Clover, but through them, also about Elaine. Day 3 dash. Clover stared at me for a long time today. The way you used to look when you knew I was hiding something. Maybe it can sense it too. Loneliness or longing, I'm not sure. Day 5 dash. Clover doesn't like rain. As soon as the drops fall, it hides under the table, eyes wide, ears down, just like you did, clutching a pillow under the blanket whenever there was thunder, saying, "Lightning never strikes people, just their memories." You always said the silliest things that I never forgot. Henry realized writing these journal entries didn't make him sadder. Instead, they helped him reconnect with the memories, unafraid to remember. Clover began lying closer. Some days it rested its head on his lap while he wrote, eyes half closed as if listening. Once he leaned back in his chair, fell asleep mid-sentence, and when he awoke, Clover was still there, watching over the slumber of an old lonely man like a faithful friend. Slowly the house began to warm again, not because of the fireplace, but because there was another breath other than Henry's inside it. Henry used to think he would live the rest of his days in silence, like an old song no one listens to anymore. But Clover didn't need him to say anything. All it needed was his presence. And it was Clover who taught him. Love isn't always grand gestures. Sometimes it's simply staying beside someone who thinks it's too late to begin again. Winter came early that year. The Oregon sky looked as though it had been blanketed with a pale gray quilt, thick and still. There was no snow, but the cold wind seeping through the wooden house made the silence even deeper. Henry wasn't well. He didn't know when it started, perhaps from sleepless nights or because he forgot to wear a coat while checking on the old lavender plants in the garden. All he knew was that morning, as he stepped off the porch with the kettle in hand, his body suddenly swayed, chilled to the bone, as if he himself had become part of that gray sky. He didn't eat lunch, didn't read, didn't turn on the lights. He simply lay in the armchair where Elaine used to sit, pulled a thin blanket over himself, and closed his eyes halfway. His body trembled from a light fever, his mind drifting between sleep and waking. At times he thought he heard footsteps very soft. At times he felt a small warmth pressing gently against his chest, but he was too tired to open his eyes and see. Until a very gentle touch on the back of his hand startled him awake. It was Clover, not lying on the floor as usual, not sitting by the window nor hiding in the corners when strange sounds filled the house. It lay right on top of him, quietly, resting its head on his hand, eyes wide open, watching him as if guarding the entire world. When he opened his eyes, Clover nudged his hand again, softly, slowly, as if to say, "I'm here." And Henry cried, for the first time in many long months, not from sadness and not from pain, but because for the first time he felt loved. Love may fade, but the feeling of being loved, once it's touched again, awakens parts of the soul we thought had turned to stone. Henry gently wrapped his arms around Clover, just lightly, afraid it might run away, but Clover didn't. It stayed nestled in his arms the whole afternoon. As night fell, Henry felt a little better. The fever subsided. He got up slowly, made a cup of ginger tea, and took out the familiar leather journal. For the first time, he wrote a letter. Not just a few notes, but a real letter to Elaine. "My dearest Elaine, today I caught a slight cold. Nothing serious, but I felt like a child lost, weary, longing for someone to sit beside me. And Clover did just that. It lay on me, nudged my hand the way you used to when I was tired. No words, no requests, and just there. You once said as long as there's something to care for, we won't fall so easily. I think you sent Clover, like a gentle echo of yourself to remind me I am still worthy of love. And you know what? Today, I cried, not because I was sad, but because I realized my heart is still alive." From that night on, Henry wrote a letter to his wife every evening. None were ever sent. They were kept in a small wooden box, placed in the drawer beside his bed, where he had once kept Elaine's hairbrush, a dried sprig of lavender, and now, a new photo, Clover asleep by the window. That habit became a ritual. Each night make tea, call Clover to his side, write a letter, and reread the old ones. Henry no longer felt lonely in the long nights, because in the gentle breath of Clover, in the silence that no longer felt distant, he had found something truly precious, a quiet life beside his own. There were nights when Clover would leap onto the table, sit right next to the journal, and look at him as if waiting to be mentioned, and he would smile. "All right, little lady, looks like you're getting another few lines today." Henry had never called Clover a pet. To him, Clover was a companion, a listener who never judged, a reflection of old love in a new form, quieter, softer. Sometimes the most profound changes happen very slowly. No ringing bells, no blinding lights. Just one day, you realize the house isn't as cold as it used to be, and the twilight hours are no longer something to fear. Henry couldn't recall the exact moment he noticed it. Maybe it was the day he was making tea, and Clover jumped onto the table, curling up on Elaine's old woolen scarf, the one he had folded and tucked away carefully, like a sacred relic not to be touched. That day, instead of shooing her away, he simply watched and smiled. Or perhaps it was the morning he opened the window earlier than usual to let the sunlight in. Not because the plants needed it, but because he thought Clover might enjoy basking in the warmth. The house gradually came back to life, not because of the fireplace, but because of the little things. Clover's dish was always clean. An old pillow was placed neatly by the window. The journal entries grew longer. The letters to Elaine were written with steadier handwriting. And a faint smile crossed his lips whenever Clover nudged his hand or let out a soft meow, as if to remind him, "The tea's gone cold." One January afternoon, while Henry was sweeping leaves from the front porch, a little girl's voice called out from the gate, "Mister, is that your cat?" He looked up, slightly startled. A curly-haired girl stood beside her mother, pointing at Clover, who was lazily lounging on the steps, tail flicking with pride. Henry nodded. "Yes, she's mine. Her name is Clover." "She's so pretty. She looks like a fairy tale cat. Can I pet her?" Henry was about to answer, but Clover had already stood up, walked over, and gently brushed her head against the little girl's leg before he could say a word. The girl giggled. Her mother smiled too, then said to Henry with warm eyes, "Mr. Henry, I always thought you didn't like cats, but it seems this one changed you, didn't she?" Henry looked at Clover, then nodded quietly. "Yeah, she brought this house back to life." Word spread faster than Henry expected. A few days later, two neighborhood kids came by, sitting patiently on the porch waiting for Clover to appear. A week later, Mrs. Doris, his elderly neighbor across the street, brought over pumpkin pie and stayed for tea longer than usual. A month later, Henry did something even he was surprised by. He hung a small wooden sign outside the porch with handwritten letters, slightly crooked but round and neat. A place of rest for wandering souls, even the ones with whiskers and four paws. Below it was a little sketch of a sleeping cat, colored in with old crayons he found in Elaine's keepsake box. No one asked him to hang that sign. No one told him what he needed to do to rejoin life, but he had opened the door, because his heart had grown warm enough to allow it. Clover was no longer the stray or a guest. She was a companion, a piece of memory reborn in the form of a whiskered creature with four legs and eyes that understood what words could not. Each morning Clover still sat by the window, but now beside her was a new cloth, hand-knitted by Henry himself. At noon he read books, and if someone knocked on the door he no longer startled, but got up, opened it, and welcomed them in. At night he still wrote letters to his wife, but now the closing lines often read, "Elaine, 3 kids came by today to visit Clover. They call her the magic cat. Do you see it? This little one is doing something I thought no one ever could. She's bringing me back." And on one special night, as moonlight poured into the room, Henry looked at Clover sleeping on the sofa and whispered almost to himself, "Thank you for staying." Spring came late that year. The wind was still crisp, and the morning mist clung to the windowsill. But in the corner of the garden, once Elaine's tiny green clovers had begun to sprout. Henry hadn't planted anything, and yet from the soil he thought had long dried out, fresh shoots had found their way up. He looked at them and thought, perhaps some seeds are simply waiting for the right moment to rise, just like him, and just like Clover. Clover still napped on the old sofa each afternoon, her amber eyes glowing in the sunlight. No one taught her how to stay, how to comfort, how to hear the silence of a heart that had once been broken. Yet somehow she knew. She didn't replace Elaine, she couldn't, but she carried her warmth in a different language, the language of a small, quiet, and loyal creature. Henry no longer feared late afternoons when the golden light faded from the wooden walls. He no longer feared the rain, nor the wind howling across the roof or the ticking clock echoing through the quiet night, because now he was no longer alone, a stray cat, an old lonely heart, seemingly unrelated. And yet they saved each other in the most unexpected way. Maybe love never truly disappears, it just changes form. From a familiar smile, it becomes the gaze of a cat in sunlight. From a hand once held at night, it becomes tiny footsteps across the wooden floor. From a whispered voice in the ear, it becomes a gentle presence at your feet every time it rains. Henry still writes letters to Elaine. Each night, with soft classical music playing low, Clover lies beside him, occasionally stirring, as if nodding quietly. "Elaine, I know you're still here. You just sent a softer version of yourself back. To keep the fire in me from going out, I'm not alone anymore. Thank you. If you've ever experienced loss, if you've ever thought you were too old, too late to begin again, remember this. Sometimes all it takes is a small creature to rekindle the fire in your heart. All it asks is that you open the door, just a little. All it needs is for you to let yourself be loved again." The story of Henry and Clover isn't some grand miracle. But it is a gentle reminder. Love, once it has existed, will always find its way back, in whatever form it takes. Have you ever had a cat or a dog help you through loneliness? Share your story. I'd love to hear it. And don't forget to follow for more healing journeys like this one.